In some cases, we have no records at all from disasters in the early 1900s, except for antique photos and postcards captured at the event by local photographers. If there was a tornado or a flood, a shipwreck, or a train wreck, you can count on a local photographer to show up and take some pictures to make into real photo postcards and printed postcards. So I'm going to show you some from the early 1900s when these disaster postcards were really popular. The first one is of the SS Eastland ship, and if you're like me, probably haven't heard much about this ship. I hadn't heard of it at all until I found a real photo image of the ship. But this disaster was in July 24th, 1915. There were 2,750 passengers aboard the ship on the Chicago River, headed to Michigan City, Indiana. Most of them were young company employees headed out for a company picnic in Michigan City, which is a very popular destination. It had a bunch of amusements and things like that. I believe some roller coasters. Like I said, mostly young people headed out on that early morning. It was a Saturday, and they worked 6 days a week back then, so they would normally be working, but instead they were going for a company picnic. So said to have a very nice day. Unfortunately, 844 lost their life when the ship turned over in the Chicago River that morning. And this image shows the overturned ship, and you can see survivors on the top waiting to be rescued and boats coming to rescue them. This next image shows them looking for survivors in the Eastland wreckage. Just a horrific image. This next one shows a wider view of the ship. So you can see, this is a real photo image of the Eastland. You can see the buildings on the side, people standing on top of the buildings, watching the disaster unfold. Ship coming to the rescue, all those standing on top of the boat waiting to be rescued. Such a strange and unique and awful disaster. Because it happened so close. I mean, it was basically in Chicago and so close to the dock. The water was only 20 feet deep, but unfortunately when it turned over, people were just trapped. If they were on the side of the boat that had flopped over, they were just trapped underneath and couldn't get out. It's believed that the Titanic actually played a role in the Eastland disaster. So after the Titanic sunk in 1912, a new law was passed that required passenger ships like this to either decrease the capacity or increase the number of lifeboats that they had on board. Unfortunately, the Eastland chose to keep the capacity the same but increase the number of lifeboats, and it's thought that those added lifeboats and the weight of all the passengers on board contributed to the ship turning over. One writer described the scene like a whale going to take a nap. So it was just a crazy scene in the Chicago River of the ship overturning. Another thing I thought was interesting about this image is the back. One thing about disaster images, people didn't really get their news from the postcards. They still got the newspaper. I mean, almost everybody was reading newspapers back then. So the messages often don't match the image on the front. If you look at this Eastland one here on the back, it says, just a few lines to let you know I'm in Chicago and I'm having a fine time. So very strange that it was sent just a little bit over a week after that disaster, and they just say they're having a fine time in Chicago. The next I'm going to talk about is the biggest peacetime disaster, peacetime ship disaster in history, the Titanic, of course, which sunk in 1912. And today is actually the anniversary of the Titanic sinking. So I'm recording this on April 15th, and the Titanic sunk at night on April 14th, or in the early morning hours on April 15th is when the ship actually went down. I want to talk a little bit about how the ship was mentioned as unsinkable. So I don't believe it's actually that crazy, and I think it's a lot of revisionist history going on there. I don't think from what I've read, the marketing didn't really say unsinkable that much. I've seen it mentioned once or twice in pieces that were put out before the ship sunk, but they also said the Olympic was unsinkable. I don't think it's that the Titanic was that special, and it's not how we think of everybody saying that this is the one unsinkable ship and the Titanic will never sink. I think it was just a common marketing thing back then. I've seen it, again, with other ships. The Olympic was called unsinkable, but also I've seen a countless number of hotels on postcards were called fireproof. Unfortunately, this was just a thing people had to worry about back then. They had to worry about ships sinking and hotels and buildings that they're staying in catching fire and burning down. It was much more common back then than it is today. Another unique thing about the Titanic, in addition to how it sunk, are the types of passengers that were on board. So while the Eastland was mostly young working class people on their way across Lake Michigan to a company picnic, the Titanic was a lot of wealthier upper class people going all the way across the Atlantic. In the Titanic, many of the lives lost, over 1,500 people died, and many of them were third class passengers. They took the brunt of the deaths. Unfortunately, the first and second class passengers, it seems, were put into lifeboats first. So just for example, 3% of first class women died, but 54% of women in third class died. So not only was the disaster awful, it's awful how they prioritized people's lives based on the amount of wealth they had. I like to think that if something like that happened today, we'd prioritize people equally. This next one is a train wreck in Hurleyville, New York, February 13th, 1907. So this is a little bit earlier than both the Titanic disaster and the Eastland disaster. Train wrecks back then were actually very common. There were so many, train was one of the main ways that people got around, and there were just a ton of train wrecks. And this train actually exploded, and you can kind of tell from the first image here. It's just crazy. If you look in the front left here, you can see there's not much remaining at all of the actual engine of the train. The passenger cars are fortunately unharmed. No passengers passed away, but 3 men operating the train lost their lives. And it's just an awful explosion. You can't recognize the engine of the train at all. And 1 man was blown over 400 feet from the tracks. Thankfully, the passenger cars, you can see in the image, were unharmed and no passengers lost their lives. These next 2 images are of a tornado in Stevens Point, Wisconsin in 1908, actually the night before Thanksgiving. And newspapers called it the most terrible storm in the history of Stevens Point. The tornado, newspaper said it was only on the ground for 2 minutes, but in those 2 minutes it destroyed a brewery, a furniture company, and from what I read, 20 or more homes. Only 1 man died in the accident, thankfully. There was a lot of confusion after the tornado struck. I don't think tornadoes in that part of the country were as common, or at least not as common as in the Midwest and Tornado Alley. So after it struck, with the amount of destruction, people just gathered to look for survivors and to look for people trapped and to look for, unfortunately, people that lost their lives. And from what I could find, 1 man did lose his life, but the loss of life could have been much greater. So the man that was killed was in the same room as his wife and daughter and was hit by a wooden beam. His wife and daughter were unharmed, but the man was killed. The Stevens Point newspaper said that hundreds of lanterns could be seen bobbing among the debris that night looking for survivors. So the death toll was much smaller than initially believed. This must have been a very strong tornado. I wasn't able to find any records on it. I know they weren't grading them on the F3, F4 scale back then, but sometimes they do retroactive based on the damage. So if you know any more information about how strong this tornado was, let me know. I'd be curious. This postcard or real photo image is unique because it looks like a newspaper overlaid with an image. So Clarence Brown, 220 North Division Street, a 2-story tin room house pushed back 16 feet off foundation and tilted up, balancing on one edge of the stone foundation. Porches torn off and half the roof blown into the next street. Outbuildings destroyed. 4-story barn moved about 2 feet off foundation and partially wrecked. I also read that a train that was coming through Stevens Point around this time was reportedly struck by a barn being carried by the wind. So this was a very, very strong tornado. And I have another image here that shows more of the destruction, but you can see here the house looks like the roof is completely destroyed and a destroyed house there. You can see it looks like maybe a horse and a cart in the background there, picking up some of the rubble. Last one here I'm going to show you is not as gruesome and horrific as the other disasters, thankfully, but I thought the images were really neat. This is an ice storm in Ashtabula, Ohio. A winter storm of February 15th, 1909 brought heavy snow, sleet, and ice to the Midwest. And these images are from Ashtabula. And I really like images of blizzards and snow and ice. I just think they're really neat, especially from back then. But you can see here the trees and power lines iced over. In the next image you can see people gathered on the street. Looking at the damage, you can see the power line there is tilting over, and the trees, I'm sure a ton of trees fell down. Trees really can't take on that much ice without branches snapping and trees getting uprooted. And this last one again here just shows more down power lines. Looks like some tree branches and trees falling on the power line. So that was February 14th, 1909. The ice storm, I'm not sure how much was ice and how much was snow, but a storm in Ashtabula, Ohio. Those are all of the disasters I have for you today. I do have a lot of other images of disasters, so if you'd like to see more content like this, covering disasters in the early 1900s, let me know. Again, like I said, a lot of them we don't have many records on at all, so in a lot of cases the photo postcards and printed postcards that were produced are the only information we have about these disasters. So if you want to hear more about disasters and tornadoes and other things like that, just let me know in the comments. But thank you so much for watching.